Sometimes a story begins not with sound, but with the absence of one. In a world built on voices, laughter, and warning bells, one 8-year-old girl moved through crystalline silence, while pain carved patterns only she could feel. What would unfold over the next 72 hours would shatter assumptions held by some of the brightest medical minds on the eastern seaboard and prove that truth often waits in places no one thinks to look. The Hartwell Coastal Resort rose from the main shoreline like a monument to old money and new ambition, all glass and granite facing the Atlantic's endless churn. Tonight, the grand ballroom glowed with champagne light and carefully orchestrated elegance. 200 guests in evening wear moved through choreographed social rituals, their mouths forming words, their glasses touching in silent toasts, their shoes tapping rhythms on polished marble that created a symphony one person would never hear. Emma Hartwell stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, small hands gripping a leather sketchbook against the white fabric of her dress. Beyond the glass, winter waves rolled and crashed in moonlit fury, throwing foam 20 feet into the air. She pressed one palm flat against the cold surface and felt the vibration travel up her arm, into her chest, the only connection she had to that distant roar. The ocean had always been her favorite place because it didn't require ears to experience. You could feel it in your bones. Inside the ballroom, a string quartet warmed up near the stage. The violinist drew her bow across strings, adjusting tension, creating notes that floated through the room like promises. Emma watched the woman's arm move, watched her fingers dance, watched her face concentrate on something Emma could only imagine. Then the familiar spike of pain lanced through her right ear, sharp enough to make her breath catch. Her hand flew up instinctively, covering the source, her small face twisting before she could school it back to the careful blankness adults seemed to prefer. No one in the crowd noticed. They were too busy being important, being seen, being heard. But across the ballroom, near the service entrance where shadows pooled thick, a man in a Navy maintenance uniform paused in his inspection of an exit light. His eyes tracked the small figure by the window, registered the sudden movement, the hand to the ear, the wince she tried to hide. Something in his chest tightened with recognition he couldn't yet name. Emma opened her sketchbook with trembling fingers. The page fell to a drawing she'd worked on for weeks, adding detail whenever the ache grew too insistent to ignore. A right ear, anatomically precise for a child's rendering, surrounded by spiraling black lines that radiated outward like shockwaves. She'd learned anatomy from medical books because understanding the shape of things sometimes made them less frightening. But this shape, this source of endless, throbbing pressure, remained a mystery no book explained. She pressed harder with her pencil, darkening the spirals until the graphite began to tear the paper. The man in the maintenance uniform turned away, forcing himself back to work. First shift, new job, explicit instructions to stay invisible and professional. He adjusted his tool belt and moved down the corridor toward the electrical panel that had been flickering all week. But his mind stayed on that small figure, drawing pain with such practiced precision. Ben Torres had learned to read warning signs the hard way. 15 years as an industrial electrician had taught him that systems failed in predictable patterns if you knew where to look. A light flickering meant voltage instability. A burning smell meant insulation breaking down. A child flinching at sound while supposedly deaf meant something the textbooks had missed. He'd spent his career trusting his instincts about faulty wiring and failing infrastructure. Right up until the night those instincts hadn't been enough to save the person who mattered most. The memory hit him as he knelt by the electrical panel, sudden and sharp as it always was. Sarah, his wife of 10 years, working late at the distribution warehouse because they needed the overtime. The call had come at 11:15 on a Thursday night 8 years ago. Fire department, police, words that didn't make sense arranged in sequences that shattered everything. Faulty alarm system. Building owners had ignored the maintenance reports for 18 months. By the time the sprinklers activated, the electrical fire had already consumed the data center where Sarah processed inventory logs. The rich men who owned that warehouse paid a fine that amounted to 3 days of profit. Sarah paid with her life. Ben had walked away from electrical work after that. Couldn't trust himself around systems that killed when they failed. Couldn't look at circuit breakers without seeing his wife's face. For 8 years, he drifted through manual labor jobs, each one a step down from the last. each one easier to leave when the nightmares got too loud. Now he pushed a mop at a billionaire's resort and told himself this was temporary, just until the custody hearing, just until he could prove to a judge that he deserved to have his son full-time instead of every other weekend. Dylan, 10 years old now, living with his grandmother in a two-bedroom apartment that smelled like menthol cigarettes and resignation. Smart kid, kind heart, played guitar like he was having a conversation with the instrument. He deserved better than a father who'd let grief hollow him out. He deserved the version of Ben who had once been good at his work, confident in his decisions, capable of protecting the people he loved. The tool belt felt foreign on Ben's hips after so many years away from real technical work. The resort manager had hired him specifically for his electrical background, some insurance requirement about having licensed personnel on staff. Ben had let his certifications lapse, but the knowledge remained, buried under guilt and self-doubt. He tightened a loose connection in the panel and felt muscle memory take over. His hands remembering procedures his conscious mind tried to forget. Footsteps approached from the hallway, the sharp click of expensive heels on stone. Ben glanced up to see a woman in a charcoal business suit moving with the controlled urgency of someone perpetually late for the next important thing. Victoria Hartwell, owner of this resort and 17 others scattered across 3 continents. He'd seen her photo in the employee handbook next to mission statements about excellence and service. The photo didn't capture the exhaustion around her eyes or the way she held her shoulders like she was bracing against invisible weight. Victoria swept past without acknowledging his existence, already pulling out her phone to handle whatever crisis demanded immediate attention. In her world, maintenance workers were part of the architecture, functional and forgettable. Ben had grown used to that invisibility. It made the work simpler when no one expected conversation. But he'd seen her daughter, seen the pain the child tried to hide. And something about that combination, the oblivious mother and the suffering child, scraped against old wounds Ben thought had scarred over. He finished the panel work and moved deeper into the building, checking emergency lights and exit signs in the labyrinth of service corridors that kept the resort's machinery hidden from paying guests. His radio crackled with routine traffic. Housekeeping needed extra towels in 304. Kitchen reported a refrigerator making unusual noises. The ordinary problems of a building this size, each one solvable with enough attention and the right tools. Near midnight, Ben paused outside what his facility map labeled as the family wing. Residential quarters, private spaces, absolutely off limits unless specifically called. Through a partially open door, he could see warm light spilling from what looked like a study or art room. The same scratching sound he'd heard earlier drifted into the hallway, rhythmic and insistent. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils and sketch paper, working on another version of that same drawing. This one showed the ear in even greater anatomical detail, the spirals darker, more urgent. She'd added red dots radiating outward like sparks from a live wire. Between strokes, she pressed her palm against her right ear, her face scrunching with discomfort before smoothing back to concentration. Ben watched from the shadows, his electrician's mind cataloging the pattern. Pain that came in waves. Pain focused on one specific location. Pain the child had learned to document because no one else seemed interested in understanding it. He thought about the years he'd spent tracing intermittent faults, those maddening problems that only appeared under specific conditions. You had to be patient with those. You had to watch and wait and trust that the pattern would eventually reveal itself. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the drawing, zooming in to capture the detail. Not for any clear purpose, just the instinct of a technician documenting an anomaly. Then he backed away before the child could notice his presence and feel observed in her private struggle. The employee break room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaning products. Ben sat at a plastic table under fluorescent lights that hummed at 60 hertz, a sound most people filtered out but that electricians never stopped hearing. He dialed Dylan's number and waited through 3 rings before his son's voice filled the line with warmth that made Ben's chest ache. Dylan talked about his day, about school and homework, and a new song he was learning on guitar. Ben closed his eyes and just listened, letting that voice push back against 8 years of silence and grief. When Dylan asked about the new job, Ben found himself describing the little girl he'd seen, the one everyone said was deaf, but who clearly reacted to sound with pain instead of the startle reflex or simple non-response you'd expect. Dylan went quiet for a moment, thinking in that careful way he had. Then he said something that made Ben sit straighter. Remember when the doctor thought I had hearing loss, but it was just that stupid cotton swab stuck in my ear? Took them 3 visits to actually look close enough to see it. Ben's hand tightened on the phone. Yeah, I remember. Maybe you saw something they didn't, Dylan continued, his voice matter-of-fact in the way only children could be when stating obvious truths. You're good at finding problems. That's what you used to do. After they said goodnight, Ben sat in the break room for another 20 minutes, staring at the photo of Emma's drawing. The ear, the spirals, the red sparks of documented pain. He thought about his son's words, about doctors who looked but didn't see, about the difference between hearing what people said and actually listening to what they meant. His shift ended at 6 in the morning, but Ben stayed late to walk the building perimeter as dawn broke cold and clear over the Atlantic. The resort grounds were immaculate, every shrub trimmed, every path swept clean of autumn leaves. Money could buy that kind of perfection in the visible spaces, but money couldn't fix what it refused to acknowledge in the shadows. He returned home to a studio apartment 3 miles inland, small and sparse with just the essentials. On his bedside table sat a framed photo of Sarah, Dylan at age 2 in her arms, both of them laughing at something just outside the camera's view. Ben had spent 8 years trying to earn the right to look at that photo without shame, trying to become again the kind of man who noticed when something was wrong and did something about it instead of walking away. He lay down without sleeping, his mind too active to rest. The memory of Emma's face stayed with him, the practiced blankness overlaying genuine suffering. He'd seen that expression before on his own face in mirrors during the worst months after Sarah died. The look of someone who'd learned that showing pain only made others uncomfortable. Around noon, Ben gave up on sleep and drove to the public library. The reference desk librarian looked surprised when he asked for access to medical databases, but she set him up at a computer terminal with visitor credentials. He spent 3 hours reading about pediatric hearing loss, congenital conditions, diagnostic protocols. The language was dense and technical, but not incomprehensible to someone who'd spent years reading electrical code and equipment specifications. What struck him most was how much of the diagnostic process seemed to rely on initial assessment. Once a child was classified as congenitally deaf, every subsequent test got interpreted through that lens. Treatment plans assumed permanent impairment. Pain complaints got dismissed as unrelated or psychosomatic. The system was built to confirm its own conclusions. Ben found a study about foreign objects in ear canals of NICU infants. Apparently, the protective ear coverings used in neonatal intensive care units sometimes broke down, leaving fragments too small to see without specialized equipment. In the documented cases, children had lived for years with chronic pain, recurrent infections, and partial hearing loss, all attributed to their primary diagnosis until someone finally looked closely enough to see the actual cause. He took notes in a small spiral notebook, documenting citation numbers and key findings. It felt good to use his mind this way again, to follow a technical problem to its logical conclusion. This was what he'd been good at once, before grief had convinced him he couldn't trust his own judgment. That evening, he returned to the resort for his second shift. The manager briefed him on routine tasks and reminded him again to stay out of the family wing unless specifically called for maintenance. Ben nodded and signed the duty log, then went about his work with the same invisible efficiency expected of hired help. But he made a point to walk past Emma's art room again around 10 o'clock. She was there, same position, same drawing, same hand pressed against her ear between careful pencil strokes. The pattern held. Whatever was hurting her hurt in predictable cycles. The next day, Ben sought out Maria Chen, the interpreter who worked with Emma. He found her in a small office reviewing lesson plans, a middle-aged woman with patient eyes and quick hands that moved through sign language like a pianist playing familiar scales. He knocked on the open door frame. "Excuse me, I'm Ben Torres, new maintenance guy. I was hoping you could teach me some basic signs." Maria looked up, surprised but not unfriendly. "For work reasons or personal ones?" Ben chose honesty. "I've seen you with Emma. I don't want to scare her by talking when she can't respond. Just simple things. Sorry. Thank you. Are you okay?" Something in Maria's expression softened. She gestured to a chair. "Most people don't bother. They just talk louder and hope. Yeah, Ben said quietly. That sounds familiar. Maria taught him slowly, demonstrating each sign multiple times until his rough hands could approximate the shapes. Sorry, a fist making a circle over the heart. Thank you, fingers moving from chin outward. Pain, two index fingers twisting toward each other like opposing electrical charges. Ear, pointing to the side of his head. Right, left, the directional qualifiers that turn basic vocabulary into specific communication. Ben practiced until the movements felt less foreign, until his fingers remembered the patterns even when his conscious mind fumbled. He'd learned complex technical procedures this way, through repetition and muscle memory. Sign language followed the same principle. You built the skill one gesture at a time. Before he left Maria's office, he asked one more question. Has Emma always seemed to be in pain? Or is this getting worse? Maria's hand stilled. She's been drawing those ear pictures for 3 years. At first, just occasionally. Now almost every day. Her doctors say it's psychosomatic, phantom sensations from nerve pathways that never developed properly. Ben filed that information away. 3 years of escalating documentation. 3 years of a child trying to communicate distress through the only medium that didn't require sound. That night during his rounds, Ben deliberately timed his corridor walk to coincide with Emma's usual art room session. He made sure his tool belt clinked softly as he approached, not trying to be silent, but not announcing himself either. When he rounded the corner, she was there as expected, hunched over her sketchbook. He moved slowly into her peripheral vision, not wanting to startle her. When she looked up, he raised one hand and signed the simple greeting Maria had taught him. Hi. Emma's eyes widened slightly. She put down her pencil and watched his hands with sudden intense focus. Ben pointed to himself and fingerspelled his name slowly. Jake. Then he pointed to himself again and signed the shortened version Maria had suggested, a simple gesture that combined the letter J with a forward motion. Emma nodded once, acknowledging the introduction. Her hands moved in fluid signs Ben couldn't follow, too fast and complex for his beginner's vocabulary. But he caught the shape of a question at the end. He shook his head and signed the only honest response he knew. Sorry, learning slow. To his surprise, Emma smiled. Not a big expression, just a slight curve of her lips, but genuine. She picked up her pencil and wrote in large letters across a blank page, Emma. Then she pointed to herself and made a graceful sign, her own name rendered in a gesture he could try to remember. Ben copied the movement, clumsy but sincere. Emma's smile widened a fraction. Then she turned her sketchbook around to show him the drawings she'd been working on. The ear, the spirals, the red sparks of pain. He looked at the image for a long moment, then met her eyes and signed the question Maria had taught him. Pain? He pointed to his own ear, then gestured right, left, inviting her to specify. Emma's hand moved immediately to her right ear. She tapped it twice, emphatic. Then she held up her other hand with fingers spread, closing them one at a time in what Ben understood as a measurement of intensity. All 5 fingers, maximum pain. Ben's jaw tightened. He signed carefully. I see. Then he tapped his own chest near his heart and made a gesture of promise, even though he wasn't sure if that sign existed in formal ASL. I see you. Emma stared at him for several heartbeats. Then she reached out and touched the tool belt at his waist, her fingers brushing the canvas fabric with tentative curiosity. When he nodded permission, she examined the various pouches and loops, the assortment of screwdrivers and pliers and wire strippers that marked his trade. She pointed to a voltage tester and raised her eyebrows in question. Ben pulled it out and demonstrated, touching the probe to a nearby electrical outlet. The small LED indicator lit up red, showing live current. Emma watched with fascination, her pain momentarily forgotten in simple curiosity about how things worked. He showed her a few more tools, naming each one with basic signs and gestures, letting this small interaction create a bridge neither of them had expected to cross. When her tutor's voice called from down the hallway that lessons were resuming, Emma gathered her art supplies quickly. But before she left, she touched Ben's sleeve and signed thank you with perfect, grateful clarity. Ben watched her go, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Protective instinct, maybe. Or the ghost of his electrician's conviction that every problem had a solution if you looked hard enough at the wiring underneath. The next 2 days passed in routine work assignments and careful observation. Ben kept his distance from Emma, but made sure to be visible when she used the common corridors, offering small waves and simple signs that built familiarity without intrusion. He watched how she moved through the resort, how she pressed her hand to her ear at irregular intervals, how her face tightened when the pain spiked despite her best efforts to hide it. On his fourth night, a maintenance request sent him to Victoria Hartwell's private office suite, outlets acting up near the private study. The work order read, "Standard electrical troubleshooting, nothing complicated." Ben gathered his testing equipment and headed to the family wing, radio in to confirm the suite was unoccupied. The office was exactly what he'd expected. Expensive furniture, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, framed awards and achievements covering one wall, a crystal decanter on a side table, probably containing scotch worth more than Ben's monthly rent. He moved to the outlet panel and began his methodical testing, checking voltage and ground connections, looking for the loose wire or failing breaker that would explain the reported issues. Then his gaze landed on the desk where a laptop sat in sleep mode, its screen glowing faintly. Medical imaging software, unmistakable even from across the room. And on the screen, visible because Victoria had apparently been reviewing it before stepping out, a series of ear canal cross-sections labeled with Emma's name and medical record number. Ben froze. This wasn't his business. This was private medical information, confidential and protected. But his eyes were already tracking the images on the screen, his pattern recognition instincts activating before conscious thought could stop them. 6 images, 6 different angles of Emma's right ear canal, and in each image, in the exact same relative position, a curved dark shadow hugging the canal wall. The notation beneath each scan read the same. Shadow, artifact, not clinically significant. Ben's breath went shallow. He'd spent 15 years troubleshooting electrical systems, learning to distinguish between random noise and meaningful signal. If a voltage spike appeared once on an oscilloscope, you called it static interference. If it appeared in the same position across multiple readings, you called it a fault that needed investigation. This was the same principle. Same shadow, same location, multiple scans. That wasn't artifact. That was something real. He pulled out his phone before he could second-guess the decision and took quick photos of the screen, zooming in to capture the shadow's position and the dismissive notation. Then he moved back to the outlet panel, finished the repair he'd come to do, and left the office with his heart pounding like he'd stolen something more valuable than information. Back in his apartment hours later, Ben stared at the photos on his phone. He wasn't a doctor. He had no medical training beyond basic first aid, but he knew systems, knew how components interacted, knew what it looked like when something didn't belong in a confined space. And he knew people who might be able to confirm what his instincts were screaming. Lisa Park had been an ENT nurse at Maine Medical Center for 20 years. She'd also been one of the nurses who'd helped Ben through the worst of his grief when Sarah died, when he'd spent weeks camped in hospital waiting rooms because being around her coworkers felt closer to being with her. Lisa had been kind without being pitying, practical without being cold. Ben hadn't spoken to her in years, but he still had her number buried in his old contacts. He called at 2 in the morning, knowing she worked night shifts. She answered on the second ring. Ben Torres, her voice came through tired but warm. "It's been a long time. No, I'm sorry. I need your brain for a medical question." He described what he'd seen without using names or specific details. 8-year-old girl, diagnosed congenitally deaf, recurring pain in right ear, multiple scans showing same shadow and same position, dismissed as artifact. What could cause that? Lisa was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then her voice took on the careful precision of someone walking through diagnostic logic. If a shadow appears consistently across multiple imaging angles, it's probably not artifact. Could be a foreign body. With NICU babies, we use protective ear coverings to reduce ambient noise. Sometimes those break down, leave fragments. Plastic usually. Small enough to miss on casual inspection, but large enough to cause chronic inflammation, pain, distorted hearing. How long could something like that stay in there? Lisa sighed. I've seen cases go 5, 6 years before someone thought to look closely. The child's already labeled deaf, so nobody questions the symptoms. pain gets attributed to ear infections or growing pains. Hearing loss is explained by the primary diagnosis. It's not malicious. It's just how confirmation bias works in medicine. Ben's hands tightened on the phone. And if it's been there 8 years, then that child has been in unnecessary pain for 8 years. But Ben, her voice sharpened, I can't diagnose over the phone. I can't even speculate responsibly without seeing the patient. What you're describing is hypothetical, I understand. Thank you. He hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. The pieces fit together too perfectly to ignore. NICU baby, protective ear covering, fragment left behind. 8 years of pain attributed to a condition that might not even exist. And a mother too busy building an empire to question the experts who'd handed her a diagnosis wrapped in medical certainty. Ben knew what happened next in the normal chain of events. He should report this to his supervisor, who would kick it up to resort management, who would probably do nothing because suggesting a billionaire's child had been misdiagnosed for 8 years was the kind of liability nightmare that made corporate lawyers break out in hives. Or he could approach Victoria Hartwell directly with his concerns and risk getting fired for overstepping boundaries that were clearly marked and reinforced. Neither option felt adequate. But doing nothing, walking away, pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen, that felt impossible. He'd walked away once before when a system was failing, told himself it wasn't his problem, and his wife had paid the price. The next morning, Ben waited outside Victoria Hartwell's office. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, chosen his words carefully to sound concerned rather than accusatory, helpful rather than intrusive. When she arrived, moving through the hallway with her usual controlled urgency, he stepped forward before courage could fail him. Mrs. Hartwell, could I speak with you for a moment? It's about Emma. Victoria stopped, her expression shifting from distracted to guarded in an instant. What about her? Ben kept his voice level. Has she been touching her right ear frequently? Reacting to certain sounds even though she's supposedly deaf? Victoria's face went cold. Why are you asking me this? Because I've seen her in pain, and I've seen medical images that suggest there might be something physically wrong that's been missed. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. You went through my daughter's medical files. The laptop was open. I was there to fix an outlet. I saw the scans by accident. But what I saw, Ben pressed forward even as Victoria's expression hardened to stone. There's a shadow that appears in the same place in multiple images. That's not normal artifact. That could be a foreign object. Victoria took a step toward him, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You think you, a maintenance worker, have discovered what 7 board-certified specialists missed? You think because you saw some scans you don't have the training to interpret, you understand my daughter's condition better than doctors from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic? I think children don't draw pain unless they feel it, Ben said. And your daughter has been drawing her ear in pain for 3 years. Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. You have no idea what I've sacrificed for her, what I've spent, the treatments, the hope, the failures. Don't you dare stand there and suggest I haven't done everything possible. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Her voice rose slightly, control slipping. That I've been a negligent mother? That I've ignored my child's suffering? That I should trust a janitor's opinion over specialists who've dedicated their lives to pediatric medicine? Ben held his ground. I'm saying maybe everyone's been so focused on the diagnosis they received 8 years ago that nobody's looked for other explanations. Victoria's hands trembled slightly before she clenched them into fists. From now on, Mr. Torres, your responsibility is to maintain this property. Nothing more. Stay away from Emma unless there's a legitimate maintenance emergency. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am. He turned to leave, but something on the wall caught his eye. Emma's latest drawing pinned to a corkboard in the hallway outside Victoria's office. The same ear, the same spirals, but this version had more red dots, more dense and urgent. A child's SOS rendered in colored pencil and desperate hope. Ben looked at it for a long moment, then back at Victoria. Someone has to listen to her. Her face crumpled for just an instant before she pulled the mask back into place. Get out of my sight. Ben walked away with his chest tight and his certainty absolute. He just killed any chance of helping Emma through official channels. But he'd also seen Victoria's face in that unguarded moment, the guilt and fear warring behind her anger. She knew something was wrong. She just couldn't afford to admit it. The rest of that day passed in mechanical routine. Ben completed his assigned tasks with the same invisible efficiency he'd cultivated. But his mind kept circling back to the problem, approaching it from different angles like an electrician troubleshooting an intermittent fault. Late afternoon, his phone buzzed with a weather alert. Major nor'easter forming off the coast, expected to make landfall within 48 hours. Hurricane force winds, potential for power outages, and structural damage. All resort staff to report for storm preparation duty starting tomorrow morning. Ben checked the extended forecast and felt his stomach drop. The storm would hit exactly when Victoria was scheduled to fly to Europe for some experimental medical consultation. He'd overheard her assistant discussing the travel arrangements, the connection through London, the appointment with a specialist in Switzerland who apparently offered cochlear implant procedures with 1% success rates. 1%. Victoria was flying across the Atlantic to subject her daughter to an invasive surgery with a 1% chance of success, because she'd been told 8 years ago that Emma would never hear, and she'd built her entire understanding of reality on that foundation. Ben spent the evening in his apartment, watching the weather projections intensify. The nor'easter was strengthening faster than predicted, pulling moisture and energy from the warming Atlantic. By tomorrow night, it would be a full-scale coastal storm, the kind that knocked out power for days and reminded humans that some forces couldn't be controlled by money or determination. He thought about Emma, alone in that big resort with her mother chasing false hope in Europe. He thought about his son Dylan, safe in his grandmother's apartment, but still waiting for a father who could prove himself reliable. He thought about Sarah, dead because people with authority had ignored warning signs until it was too late. The decision crystallized with the same certainty he used to feel when tracking down a dangerous electrical fault. You couldn't walk away from a system on the edge of catastrophic failure. You couldn't tell yourself it wasn't your problem when you were the only one who saw the danger. Tomorrow he'd show up for storm prep duty like every other employee. But he'd also position himself close to Emma's wing of the resort, close enough to respond if the system finally failed in the way he suspected it would, because 8 years of misdiagnosis couldn't continue indefinitely. Something would give, and when it did, Ben intended to be there. He called Dylan before bed, needing to hear his son's voice, needing the reminder of what he was trying to become again. Dylan talked about a math test and a new guitar chord progression. His enthusiasm infectious even through the phone's compressed audio. Before they hung up, Ben said something he hadn't said in years. "I'm proud of you, son. You're turning into someone I admire." Dylan's voice went soft. "Thanks, Dad. You're someone I admire too." After the call ended, Ben sat in the dark and let himself feel the weight of that trust. A 10-year-old's faith that his father was still the kind of man worth admiring. It was terrifying and precious in equal measure. The next morning dawned gray and restless, the wind already picking up as the storm's outer bands began to reach inland. Ben reported to the resort at 6 a.m. and spent the day securing outdoor furniture, checking generator connections, testing emergency lighting systems. The work was familiar and grounding, each task completed with the careful attention that had once defined his professional life. Around midday, he saw Victoria's car pull up to the main entrance, luggage loaded in the trunk. Emma appeared in the doorway of the main building, small and alone, one hand pressed against the glass as her mother climbed into the back seat. Their goodbye had apparently already happened inside, private and insufficient. Ben watched from across the parking area as Victoria's car pulled away toward the airport. Emma stood at the window for a long time after it disappeared, her hands still flat against the cold glass. Then she turned and walked back into the building, shoulders hunched against burdens no 8-year-old should carry. The storm moved closer. By afternoon, the first raindrops began to fall, sporadic and heavy. By evening, the wind had picked up to 30 miles per hour, rattling windows and finding every gap in the building's weather ceiling. The resort manager gathered all staff for a final briefing, emphasizing that tonight they were responsible for guest safety and property protection. No one went home until the storm passed. Ben suited up in his rain gear and began the first of what would be many rounds through the building, checking sump pumps in the basement, verifying generator fuel levels, testing battery backups on critical systems. The methodical work of someone who understood that prevention was always easier than emergency response. But with each circuit through the building, he made sure his path took him past Emma's wing, past her art room where she'd retreated with her tutor, past the family living quarters where she'd eventually try to sleep while the storm raged outside. He wasn't violating Victoria's order to stay away. He was just doing his job with unusual thoroughness. Around 9 p.m., the power flickered for the first time. Lights dimmed, stabilized, dimmed again. Ben checked his radio and heard reports coming in from across the resort. Guests were nervous. The backup generator was online but struggling with the load. The wind had increased to 50 miles per hour and still climbing. Ben headed to the main electrical room to monitor the systems personally. But on the way out, passing through the corridor near Emma's wing, he heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the storm's roar. The scratch, scratch, scratch of pencil on paper. He paused, listening. The sound came from Emma's art room, the door slightly ajar. He shouldn't look. He'd been ordered to stay away. But something in that desperate scratching pulled him forward. Emma sat on the floor, surrounded by drawings. Dozens of them, all variations on the same theme. The ear, the spirals, the red dots. But these were different, more frantic, the lines darker and more chaotic. She was pressing the pencil so hard, it tore the paper in places. Her small face twisted with pain she could no longer hide. Ben's chest constricted. This was it. The system failing. The warning signs everyone else had ignored finally reaching critical mass. The lights flickered again, held, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in dim greenish half-light. Through the window, lightning forked across the sky, and even Emma seemed to feel its concussive force through the building structure. She dropped her pencil and pressed both hands against her right ear, her mouth opening in what might have been a scream if she'd ever learned how to make that sound. Ben moved into the room before conscious thought could stop him. He knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder to get her attention. When she looked up, her eyes were glazed with pain and fear. He signed quickly. Pain? Here? She nodded frantically, hands still covering her ear. Ben made a decision that would change all their lives. He signed with careful deliberation. I help, okay? Emma stared at him for several heartbeats. Then slowly, desperately, she nodded. Ben pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight app. He signed for Emma to tilt her head, to let him look. She did, trusting him in that moment more than she'd trusted any of the dozens of doctors who'd examined her before. He angled the light into her ear canal, looking for what he already knew he'd find. And there it was, a curved piece of dark plastic, maybe 8 millimeters long, wedged against the canal wall and hugging it so closely that casual inspection would miss it completely. The kind of thing that would show up on imaging as a shadow. The kind thing that would cause 8 years of chronic pain and partial hearing loss while everyone focused on a diagnosis that had never been accurate. Ben pulled back, his hands shaking. He took a photo with his phone, documenting what he'd seen. Then he looked at Emma's tear-streaked face and signed the words that would set everything in motion. We go hospital. Now. Fix this. The lights flickered again. The storm hammered at the building with increasing fury. And somewhere 50 miles away, in an airport terminal, Victoria Hartwell was boarding a plane to chase hope in the wrong direction, while the real answer waited in her daughter's ear, finally seen by someone who'd refused to stop looking. Ben gathered Emma in his arms and stood, feeling the weight of responsibility and terrible clarity. He'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But some lines existed to be crossed when children were suffering and systems were failing, and 80 years of pain demanded an end. He carried Emma toward the garage, toward his truck, toward the hospital and the storm, and whatever consequences would follow. Behind them, the resort's emergency system strained against the darkness. Ahead, lightning split the sky in jagged brilliance. And in Emma's right ear, invisible to everyone except the maintenance man, who'd learned to trust his instincts about failing systems, a fragment of plastic that should have been removed 8 years ago waited to give up its hold on a child's life. 3 weeks after the extraction, Emma sat in the Hartwell Foundation's newly established offices, a converted wing of the resort that had been transformed into something purposeful beyond luxury. The walls displayed children's artwork, testimonials from families, medical equipment donated by manufacturers who'd seen the news coverage and wanted association with redemption rather than negligence. Victoria stood at the conference table reviewing settlement papers her lawyers had prepared with increasing urgency. The original NICU hospital had raised their offer to $25 million. The paperwork gleamed with legal precision, each clause designed to ensure silence, to bury the story under confidentiality agreements that would protect institutional reputations while condemning unknown numbers of children to continued suffering. Emma watched her mother from across the room, not understanding the words but reading the tension in the shoulders that had learned to carry impossible weight. She'd been practicing speech with her therapist every day, her vocabulary expanding in halting increments. Simple phrases came easier now. Full sentences remained a struggle that required concentration and courage in equal measure. Ben entered carrying coffee for Victoria and hot chocolate for Emma. He'd started officially 3 days ago, his new role giving him access to spaces and conversations he'd only glimpsed from maintenance quarters. The transition from invisible worker to decision maker still felt surreal, like wearing someone else's clothes that happened to fit. Victoria accepted the coffee without looking up. They're threatening to go public with Emma's complete medical history. Every examination, every test result, every moment of her childhood they documented. They'll paint us as opportunistic, money-hungry, exploiting a minor medical oversight for publicity. Ben set Emma's hot chocolate down and signed a greeting she returned with growing fluency. Then he turned his attention to Victoria's crisis. Are they allowed to release her records? HIPAA has exceptions for legal proceedings. They'll argue this is a liability case, that full disclosure is necessary for their defense. So call their bluff. Ben's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd stopped being impressed by institutional intimidation. Tell them you're holding a press conference either way. Let them choose whether they want to be part of the solution or the story about why solutions were necessary. Victoria finally looked up. You want me to go public before they do? I want you to control the narrative. Tell Emma's story on your terms, not theirs. Use it to launch the foundation properly. Make them choose between fighting you in court or joining you in fixing the system that failed. The words settled between them like pieces on a chessboard, strategy replacing panic. Victoria's CEO instincts kicked in, the same mind that had built an empire now applying itself to tearing down institutional indifference. She picked up her phone and dialed her communications director. Schedule a press conference for Friday. Hartwell Resort, main ballroom. National media, medical journals, patient advocacy groups. We're announcing the foundation and telling Emma's complete story. No holds barred. After she disconnected, Victoria looked at Ben with something approaching respect that had nothing to do with gratitude. You've done this before. Gone up against institutions. Ben thought about labor disputes, safety violations he'd reported despite pressure to stay quiet, the complaints he'd filed after Sarah's death that had gone nowhere but taught him how power protected itself. I've lost a lot of those fights, but I learned what happens when you let fear make you silent. Emma stood and crossed to her mother, tapping Victoria's arm for attention. When Victoria turned, Emma signed slowly, deliberately, then pushed sound through the words she'd practiced with her therapist. Tell my story. Her voice still carried that rough unfamiliarity, consonants uncertain, but determination made each syllable clear. Help other kids. Victoria's eyes filled, but she didn't look away from her daughter's steady gaze. You're sure? It means cameras, questions, people knowing everything about what you went through. Emma nodded with the kind of certainty that came from 8 years of pain finally finding purpose. She signed additional words Ben couldn't follow, and Victoria translated. She says she was silent long enough. Time to make noise. Friday arrived with media trucks lining the resort's circular drive and satellite uplinks dotting the parking area like mechanical flowers reaching toward communication satellites. Ben watched the setup from the foundation offices, his stomach tight with an anxiety he couldn't quite name. This wasn't his world. He understood circuits and systems, not cameras, and carefully crafted statements designed for maximum impact. Dylan had taken the bus up from his grandmother's apartment, his guitar case slung over one shoulder, and excitement radiating from his entire posture. Victoria had suggested he attend, said Emma had been asking about him, wanted him present for this moment. Ben suspected his son's presence was as much for him as for Emma, an anchor to keep him grounded when institutional pressure tried to sweep them all aside. His son found him in the makeshift green room where Emma was getting prepared. Dylan's eyes went wide at the sight of Emma in a simple blue dress, her hair carefully styled, the visible hearing aid in her right ear worn like a badge rather than hidden in shame. She can really hear now? Dylan's voice dropped to respectful quiet. About 70% in the right ear, more in the left, Ben explained. Still improving every day. Emma spotted Dylan and her face transformed with the kind of unguarded joy that hadn't been possible when everything hurt. She signed a greeting Maria had taught her, then spoke aloud. Hi, Dylan, you brought guitar? Dylan grinned and hoisted his case. Thought maybe after all this is done, I could play you something, if you want. Emma's nod was enthusiastic enough to make her wince slightly, the ears still tender from lingering inflammation. Want. Very. Want. The ballroom filled rapidly, 200 seats claimed by journalists whose careers depended on finding stories that mattered to audiences, growing numb to manufactured outrage. Ben recognized the setup from news coverage he'd seen over the years. The podium bristling with microphones, the cameras positioned for optimal angles, the low murmur of professionals assessing whether this story warranted the disruption to their schedules. Victoria entered from a side door, her bearing that of someone who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and wasn't intimidated by public scrutiny. But Ben saw the tremor in her hands before she gripped the podium, the way she glanced back to confirm Emma was close enough to reach if courage failed. She began with facts. Her name, her company, her daughter's diagnosis 8 years prior. The timeline of specialists consulted, treatments attempted, hope methodically crushed by expert consensus. Her voice remained steady through the recitation, professional distance maintaining composure. Then she deviated from the prepared remarks her PR team had drafted. I spent $4 million trying to fix my daughter. I flew to 3 continents, chasing experimental treatments. I trusted the most credentialed specialists in pediatric medicine. And I was completely catastrophically wrong. The room's energy shifted, journalists leaning forward. This wasn't corporate spin. This was confession, raw and unprotected. My daughter wasn't born deaf. She was born with perfectly functional hearing that got blocked by a piece of plastic smaller than my fingernail. For 8 years, Emma lived in pain, while I threw money at a problem money couldn't solve because I was asking the wrong questions. Victoria pulled up the first slide, the medical scans showing that curved shadow everyone had dismissed. This appeared in every scan Emma received over 8 years. 7 different specialists looked at these images. Every single one labeled it artifact, not clinically significant. Because once my daughter was diagnosed as congenitally deaf, every piece of evidence got interpreted through that lens. Another slide. Emma's drawings, the progression from simple sketches to desperate documentation of escalating pain. She was trying to tell us. For 3 years, she drew maps of her suffering. We thought it was therapeutic art processing her disability. We never considered she was creating medical evidence because no one else would listen. The journalists were typing frantically now. The story's scope expanding beyond simple misdiagnosis into systemic failure. Victoria clicked to the next slide, showing the extracted fragment in its specimen container. This is what caused 8 years of pain. Industrial plastic from NICU protective equipment, broken down and lodged where routine examination wouldn't find it. And this, Victoria's voice hardened, is the person who finally discovered it. She gestured toward the wings where Ben stood with Dylan and Emma. Ben Torres, not a doctor, not a specialist, a maintenance worker who'd been on the job for 4 days and had the audacity to trust his eyes over everyone else's credentials. Ben felt every camera in the room swivel toward him. His instinct was to step back and to fade into shadows where hired help belonged. But Emma's small hand found his, gripping tight, and Dylan pressed against his other side. His family assembled from broken pieces that had somehow fused into something stronger than what came before. Victoria continued. Ben saw what we refused to see. He questioned what we'd stopped questioning. He acted when everyone else walked past. And because of him, my daughter can hear. Because of him, I finally listened. The ballroom erupted with questions, voices overlapping in professional aggression. Victoria raised a hand for silence and got it through sheer force of presence. Emma wants to speak. Everything else can wait. The room fell silent as Emma stepped up to the podium, Maria beside her ready to translate if speech failed. But Emma had practiced this, rehearsed it with her therapist until the words felt almost natural. She gripped the microphone with both hands and looked out at 200 strangers waiting to judge her story's worth. Hello, my name is Emma. The room held collective breath, aware they were witnessing something beyond news cycle fodder. Emma pushed forward, each word requiring conscious effort. People say I was born deaf, but I was just not heard. The phrase landed with the weight of poetry, simple words arranged to cut through professional cynicism. Emma's voice gained slight confidence, muscle memory starting to override fear. I drew pictures, my ear, the pain. Nobody asked what it meant. Then Ben looked. He listened. She turned to find Ben Varshti in the wings and gestured for him to join her. He shook his head. This was Emma's moment, but she gestured again with the kind of insistence that didn't accept refusal. Ben walked out to scattered applause, feeling exposed and unworthy in equal measure. Emma continued, her hand finding his sleeve the way it had that first night when everything changed. He is not doctor. He is person who cares, that matters more. The applause started as a ripple and built to genuine warmth. Journalists responding to authentic emotion in a medium, drowning in manufactured sentiment. Emma wasn't finished. My mom is making foundation to help kids like me, kids nobody listens to. She looked up at Victoria standing behind the podium. I love you, Mom. Thank you for finally hearing. Victoria abandoned all pretense of professional composure and pulled Emma into an embrace that cameras captured from every angle. The image would run on evening news nationwide, mother and daughter reunited by truth that should have been obvious 8 years earlier. The press conference continued for another hour, questions ranging from medical specifics to legal implications to foundation operational details. But the story's core had already been established. A child suffering, a system failing, a maintenance worker succeeding where experts hadn't. The narrative was too perfect for news cycles to resist. Afterward, in the relative quiet of the foundation offices, Dylan unpacked his guitar while Emma watched with anticipation that made her seem younger than her 8 years. Ben and Victoria sat nearby, exhausted from performance anxiety finally released. You did well up there. Victoria's voice carried genuine admiration. Most adults couldn't handle that kind of pressure. Had good practice, Ben gestured toward Emma. She's been performing courage every day of her life. Dylan tuned his guitar with the casual expertise of someone who'd made the instrument an extension of thought. He looked at Emma. Any requests or you want to hear something new? Emma signed, then pushed for words. You choose. I want hear you. Dylan began playing a melody he'd composed himself, something gentle and complex that spoke to hours of practice and natural musicality. The notes filled the space, each one a gift Emma had been denied until recently. She closed her eyes and just listened, her face transforming into an expression Ben had never seen before. Pure contentment without the shadow of pain. When Dylan finished, Emma opened her eyes with tears streaming down her face. Beautiful. So beautiful. Dylan grinned and launched into something more upbeat, a folk tune with intricate finger-picking that made the guitar sound like multiple instruments. Emma started moving to the rhythm, not quite dancing, but swaying in time to music she could finally experience as intended. Victoria watched her daughter discover joy through sound and felt the weight of 8 wasted years pressed down like physical mass. Ben noticed the shift in her expression, the way guilt could ambush even in moments designed for celebration. She's okay, he offered quietly. More than okay. But she wasn't. Victoria's voice barely rose above whisper. For 8 years, she wasn't okay, and I was too blind to see it. You see now, that's what matters. Victoria turned to face him directly. How do you do that? How do you forgive yourself? Ben thought about 8 years of his own, the nights he'd spent convincing himself Sarah's death wasn't his fault, while knowing he should have checked that warehouse's safety system sooner. I just try to be present enough now that the past can't steal everything. The words hung between them, honest enough to hurt. Victoria nodded slowly, accepting wisdom from someone whose resume wouldn't suggest he possessed it. The Foundation's first board meeting convened the following week. Victoria presided with efficiency that made it clear this wasn't vanity philanthropy but serious institutional reform. Ben attended as Director of Safety Oversight. His role explicitly focused on identifying systemic failures before they caused harm. The medical director from Portland General presented findings from Emma's case review. We've identified 47 similar cases nationwide in the past decade. Children diagnosed with congenital hearing loss who actually had foreign objects, tumors, or infections that mimic nerve damage symptoms. Every single case involved multiple specialists confirming the initial diagnosis without questioning its foundation. 47 children, Victoria's voice was ice. 47 families told their children would never hear, never speak normally, never have the futures they deserved, because the system trusts credentials over evidence. The director nodded. We're proposing mandatory second opinion protocols for all congenital diagnoses. Independent review by specialists with no connection to the initial assessment, and we want to establish screening clinics in underserved areas where families can't afford the kind of comprehensive care Emma received. Make it happen. Victoria pushed a folder across the table. That's the initial funding allocation. $50 million to start, more is needed. Ben watched the meeting unfold and marveled at how quickly Victoria had pivoted from grieving mother to institutional reformer. She wielded guilt like a weapon against complacency. Her own failures transformed into fuel for preventing others from suffering the same. After the meeting, Emma's audiologist requested a private consultation. She led Victoria, Ben, and Emma to a quiet examination room and pulled up Emma's latest hearing test results. I need to show you something. These are Emma's auditory nerve response tests, full neural pathway evaluation. The results are, she paused, searching for the right words, completely normal. No damage, no developmental delays, no structural abnormalities. Victoria frowned. I don't understand. The original diagnosis said congenital auditory nerve damage. The original diagnosis was wrong. The audiologist's voice carried professional frustration. Emma's hearing apparatus was perfect at birth. The only thing wrong was the foreign object blocking signal transmission. Everything attributed to nerve damage was actually inflammation and obstruction. So she could have heard this whole time. Victoria's question emerged small and broken. If the object had been removed in the NICU, yes, Emma would have developed completely normal hearing and speech. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush. Emma watched the adults process implications she couldn't fully grasp yet, their faces showing variations of grief and rage she'd learned to recognize even when she couldn't understand their cause. That night, Victoria sat with Emma on the resort's private beach, watching waves roll in under a sky so clear that stars created their own light show. The ocean's rumble was muted but present, baseline sound that Emma could now experience as more than vibration. Victoria tried to find words that would explain the unexplainable, that would make sense of a mistake that had stolen 8 years. Con you, the doctors made an error, a very big error. Emma tilted her head, processing. What? Error? They said you couldn't hear because you were born wrong, but you weren't born wrong. You were perfect. Something got stuck in your ear that shouldn't have been there. Emma considered this with the pragmatic acceptance of children who adapted rather than dwelling. So I was supposed to hear? Always? Yes. Emma looked out at the ocean, its waves catching moonlight and throwing it back transformed. Then, I didn't lose 8 years. I was just late. Victoria pulled her daughter close, crying into her hair, while Emma sat patient and forgiving in ways adults forgot how to be. The child's wisdom about her own stolen childhood felt like judgment Victoria deserved and grace she hadn't earned. But Ben found me, Emma continued, her speech improving daily through sheer determination. So, the mistake brought Ben and Dylan and Foundation to help other kids. Victoria held on tighter, understanding that her daughter had somehow transformed catastrophic failure into purpose that made sense of suffering. Emma wasn't minimizing the lost years. She was choosing to extract meaning from them because the alternative was drowning in bitterness she was too young to sustain. The custody hearing happened in a gray courthouse that smelled like floor wax and institutional resignation. Ben sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a suit Victoria had insisted on buying him. Dylan's grandmother and her lawyer positioned across the aisle with expressions that suggested they expected easy victory. The judge reviewed the file with professional disinterest, decades of family law having worn down any idealism he'd once possessed about determining children's best interests. He looked at Ben over reading glasses that had slipped down his nose. Mr. Torres, you're requesting modification of the custody arrangement to grant you primary physical placement? Yes, Your Honor. On what grounds? Ben's lawyer, also provided by Victoria, stood to present their case. But Ben put a hand on her arm and stood himself. On the grounds that I'm finally the father my son deserves. I've spent 8 years proving I wasn't, running from responsibility because I couldn't forgive myself for my wife's death. But 3 weeks ago, I met a little girl who'd been suffering because adults trusted credentials over observation, and I couldn't walk away. Not again. The judge's expression shifted slightly, professional distance cracking. You're the maintenance worker from the news, the Hartwell case. Yes, sir. That little girl taught me something. She taught me that showing up matters more than being perfect, that listening matters more than knowing all the answers. My son deserves a father who shows up and listens. I'm ready to be that person. Dylan's grandmother's lawyer objected on procedural grounds, arguing that emotional appeals weren't evidence of changed circumstances. But Victoria stood from the gallery where she'd been seated and asked permission to address the court. The judge frowned. You're not party to this case, Ms. Hartwell. No, but I'm the person whose daughter Mr. Torres saved, and I employ him now as Director of Safety for the Hartwell Foundation. I can speak to his character, his reliability, his fitness as a parent. The judge gestured for her to continue. Victoria approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone used to having her opinions carry weight. 3 weeks ago, Ben Torres made a decision that could have cost him everything. He took my daughter to the hospital during a major storm because he trusted his observation over medical expertise. He risked criminal charges, job loss, and professional ruin because a child needed help nobody else was providing. That's the definition of good parenting, seeing need and meeting it regardless of personal cost. Dylan's grandmother stood, her voice trembling with emotion she'd been containing. That's all very dramatic, but this man has a history of instability. He quit 4 jobs in 6 years. He lives in a studio apartment. He couldn't even keep custody of his own child when his wife died. Victoria didn't flinch. He quit jobs that demanded he ignore safety violations. He lives modestly because he sends money to support his son. And he lost custody because grief made him unstable 8 years ago. We're discussing now, not then. Judge, I'm offering employment, housing assistance, and character testimony. Ben Torres is the most principled person I've met in 2 decades of business. His son deserves to be with him. The judge looked at Dylan, sitting between his grandmother and the social worker assigned to his case. Son, you're old enough to have an opinion. Where do you want to live? Dylan's voice came steady and clear. With my dad. He's been getting better for years. Everyone just stopped noticing. And now he's helping people. I want to be around someone who helps people instead of someone who's just scared all the time. The grandmother flinched but didn't argue. The judge reviewed his notes, made some calculations Ben couldn't see, then delivered judgment with the exhausted authority of someone who'd made 1,000 similar decisions. I'm granting primary physical placement to Ms. Torres, effective immediately. Grandmother retains visitation rights every other weekend and alternating holidays. We'll review the arrangement in 6 months to ensure it's serving the child's best interests. Ben's chest went tight. Dylan launched from his chair and wrapped around his father with the kind of desperate relief that suggested he'd been holding his breath for 8 years too. Over his son's head, Ben met Victoria's eyes and mouthed thank you. She nodded once, satisfaction and solidarity combined. Dylan moved in the following weekend, his belongings fitting into Ben's truck with room to spare. The apartment Victoria's foundation provided wasn't large, but it had 2 bedrooms and windows that caught morning light. Dylan claimed the smaller bedroom and immediately covered one wall with posters of guitar legends and space exploration missions that spoke to aspirations Ben wanted desperately to help nurture. That first night, Ben cooked dinner while Dylan practiced guitar in his room. The normalcy of it felt surreal, domestic routine he'd thought was gone forever. When they sat down to eat spaghetti that wasn't great but was made with effort, Dylan looked across the table with eyes too old for 10 years. Thanks for not giving up, Dad. Ben's throat closed around words he couldn't quite form. Finally, he managed, thanks for believing I could do this. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that came from knowing each other well enough that words weren't always necessary. After dinner, Dylan asked if they could visit Emma. He wanted to play more music for her, said he had been working on something special. They drove to the resort where Victoria had given them standing permission to visit. Emma's room had been moved to a suite near the foundation offices, her art supplies and therapy equipment creating organized chaos that spoke to a childhood finally allowed to be messy and creative. Emma lit up when she saw Dylan, her speech improving enough that full sentences came more naturally. Dylan, you came. I've been practicing words for you. Dylan grinned and pulled out his guitar. And I've been practicing songs for you. Fair trade? Emma nodded enthusiastically. Victoria appeared in the doorway, having been working late in the foundation offices. She smiled at the scene, her daughter surrounded by friendship that transcended the isolation deafness had imposed. Dylan began playing a melody he'd spent 2 weeks composing. It had movements that spoke to pain, transforming into joy. Silence giving way to sound. Loneliness finding connection. Emma listened with complete focus, her eyes closed and her hands moving slightly as if trying to catch notes floating through the air. When the final chord faded, Emma opened her eyes with tears streaming freely. That was your mom's song, wasn't it? Dylan's composure cracked slightly. How did you know it had sadness, but also hope, like someone you love is gone, but you remember the good parts? Dylan nodded, unable to speak. Emma crossed to him and hugged him with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood loss even if the details differed. Ben watched his son accept comfort from a child who'd been a stranger 3 weeks ago and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of family. Victoria moved to stand beside Ben, both of them witnesses to healing that had nothing to do with medical intervention. Look at them, her voice carried wonder. Creating beauty from all our failures. Not failures, Ben corrected gently, just detours we had to take to get here. Victoria turned to face him directly. You really believe that? That 8 years of Emma's pain and your grief were necessary to reach this moment? Ben thought about the question, about whether he'd trade those years if he could. Not necessary, just what happened. We can either let it destroy us or use it to build something better. The words were simple enough that they shouldn't have carried weight. But Victoria felt them land somewhere deep, in the place where guilt had been eating her alive since the night Ben carried Emma into that hospital. She'd been so focused on what she'd failed to do that she'd missed what she could still become. I don't know how to forgive myself, she admitted quietly. Then start by forgiving Emma for being perfect when you expected broken. Start by forgiving your younger self for trusting experts who were supposed to know better. Start small and work your way up. Victoria looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of seeing him as more than the maintenance worker who'd saved her daughter. You're wiser than you pretend to be, just older than I'd like to be. Grief ages you fast. They stood in compatible silence while their children created connection through music and shared understanding of what it meant to lose years and find them again transformed. Outside, the ocean maintained its endless rhythm, indifferent to human suffering and human healing in equal measure. The Foundation's grand opening gala happened 6 weeks after Emma's extraction. The resort's ballroom transformed into celebration space that erased any memory of that first night when Ben had watched a suffering child from shadows. 500 guests filled seats, donors and advocates and families whose children had been misdiagnosed, creating community from shared experience. Victoria took the podium wearing confidence that no longer felt like armor against vulnerability. She spoke about the Foundation's mission, the screening clinics already operating in 4 cities, the second opinion protocols being adopted by hospitals nationwide. 47 children had been identified and properly treated in 6 weeks. The numbers would only grow. But the real story, Victoria continued, isn't institutional reform. It's listening. Actually listening when children try to tell us they're hurting. Trusting observation over assumption. Believing that sometimes the person without credentials sees truth that experts miss. She invited Emma to join her on stage. Emma walked out wearing the same blue dress from the press conference, Her visible hearing aid a deliberate statement about embracing difference rather than hiding it. She'd practiced this speech until the words felt natural, until her voice carried confidence instead of just determination. My name is Emma Hartwell. I'm 8 years old. And for 8 years, nobody heard me say my ear hurt. The ballroom went silent, 500 people leaning in. Emma's voice strengthened. I drew pictures. I signed. I tried every way I knew to say pain. But everyone thought they already knew what was wrong. They looked at me and saw death. They didn't see hurting. She turned to find Ben in the front row next to Dylan. One person looked different, not a doctor, not someone important, just someone who paid attention. Ben saw hurting when everyone else saw death, and that changed everything. Emma gestured for Ben to join her. He shook his head, uncomfortable with attention, but she gestured again with the kind of insistence that had become her signature. Finally, he stood and walked to the stage, feeling 500 pairs of eyes tracking his movement. Emma continued, her hand finding his as it always did when she needed grounding. The foundation is my mom's way of saying sorry, but sorry to all the kids, not just me. She's making sure other kids get heard even when adults stop listening. The applause started before she finished, building to genuine warmth that acknowledged truth more powerful than any carefully crafted speech could deliver. Victoria embraced her daughter while cameras captured the moment for tomorrow's headlines. Ben stepped back, giving them space, but Emma pulled him into the embrace, creating a family portrait that defied easy categorization. Later that night, after the gala wound down and guests departed with foundation literature and commitment forms, Ben found Victoria on the resort's terrace overlooking the ocean. She changed into casual clothes that made her look less like a CEO and more like a mother still learning how to carry success built on failure's foundation. Hell of a night, Ben offered. Victoria smiled without turning. Dylan's playing guitar for Emma in her room. Maria's supervising. I thought they could use some time without adults hovering. Good call. Kid needs normal friendship more than medical supervision. Victoria finally faced him. I owe you more than a and a character reference. You don't owe me anything. Emma's hearing now. That's payment enough. But it's not, is it? Victoria's voice carried something beyond gratitude. You gave me my daughter back. You gave her a chance at the childhood she was supposed to have. How do I even begin to repay that? Ben leaned against the terrace railing, considering the question. You already are. Every child the foundation helps, every family that gets a second opinion, every doctor who learns to question initial assumptions. That's repayment I couldn't have achieved alone. So we're partners in this? In making sure what happened to Emma doesn't happen to anyone else? Ben extended his hand. Victoria shook it, the gesture carrying weight beyond professional courtesy. Partners in reform, partners in listening, partners in believing children over credentials when the evidence demands it. They stood together watching moonlight dance on waves. Two people whose lives had intersected in crisis and found common purpose in its aftermath. Not romance, not yet, maybe never. But connection built on mutual respect and shared mission to transform personal tragedy into systemic change. Inside the resort, Emma and Dylan created music that carried through open windows. Guitar notes and tentative singing combining into something beautiful and imperfect. The sound of children discovering joy in the wreckage adults had made of their early years. The sound of healing, finally loud enough for everyone to hear. 5 months after the extraction, Emma's speech therapist declared her ready for mainstream education. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning while Emma practiced pronunciation exercises, her tongue working through consonant clusters that required precision she'd never needed before. Victoria received the recommendation with mixed emotions that played across her face like weather systems. Pride that her daughter had progressed so rapidly. Fear that the world beyond the resort's protective bubble wouldn't be kind. Guilt that Emma was entering 3rd grade with the social development of a child who'd been isolated for years. Emma seemed unconcerned about the complications adults invented. She'd asked repeatedly about school, about other children, about the normal life that had been promised but never delivered. Now that promise was taking concrete form, and she approached it with the same pragmatic courage she'd shown through every other challenge. The local private academy had been carefully selected. Small class sizes, teachers trained in supporting children with hearing differences, a commitment to inclusion that went beyond legal requirement into genuine philosophy. Victoria had visited 3 times, interviewed staff, reviewed curricula with the intensity she'd once reserved for acquisition targets. Ben accompanied them on the first day, his presence requested by Emma, who'd made clear that her family now included more than biology suggested. Dylan came too, taking a personal day from his own school to support someone who'd become more than friend, something close to sister in the way children built families from choice rather than blood. Emma wore her hearing aid openly, the small device a statement about embracing what made her different rather than hiding it. Victoria had offered more discreet options, technology that could be nearly invisible, but Emma had refused with characteristic directness. Everyone needs to see I'm learning to hear. If they don't know, they can't help. The Academy's lobby smelled like new textbooks and institutional optimism. Emma's third-grade teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, greeted them with warmth that seemed genuine rather than performative. She knelt to Emma's level and spoke clearly, her face positioned so Emma could see her lips. I'm very excited to have you in my class. We've all been practicing some sign language to help you feel welcome. Emma's face transformed with surprised delight. You learned, for me, the whole class. Ms. Rodriguez gestured toward her classroom where small faces pressed against the window, curious and welcoming. We figured communication works better when everyone makes the effort. Inside the classroom, 23 children sat at desks arranged in clusters that encouraged collaboration. When Emma entered, they didn't stare at her hearing aid or whisper questions behind hands. Instead, a girl near the front signed a greeting that Emma recognized and returned, her confidence growing with each gesture that landed correctly. Victoria watched from the doorway, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Ben stood beside her, Dylan pressed against his other side, all of them witnessing a moment that should have happened years ago, but still carried weight arriving late. She's going to be fine, Ben offered quietly. Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. After a moment she managed, I never imagined she'd have this. Normal childhood things. Friends, school. The future I'd convinced myself was impossible. Nothing's impossible. Just sometimes we believe the wrong people about what can't be done. The classroom door closed gently, sealing Emma inside a world Victoria couldn't control or protect her from. It felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure, the same way learning to walk had required letting children fall until they figured out balance. Dylan settled into Ben's apartment with the ease of someone who'd been waiting for home to materialize. His belongings expanded to fill available space, guitar picks appearing in unexpected places, sheet music colonizing the coffee table, the particular kind of creative chaos that came with musicality. Ben discovered new rhythms in domestic life, making breakfast before school, checking homework that involved math he'd forgotten and history he'd never learned properly. The small negotiations about bedtime and screen time and whether pizza counted as a legitimate dinner option 3 nights in a row. Some evenings Dylan practiced guitar while Ben worked on foundation reports, documentation of screening clinics, and second opinion protocols expanding across state lines. The music became soundtrack to concentration, Dylan's improving technique marking time in a way that felt more meaningful than clocks. On weekends they visited Emma, the three of them forming a unit that defied easy categorization. Not quite family by traditional definitions, not quite friendship either. Something new built from shared trauma transformed into shared purpose. Dylan had appointed himself Emma's music teacher, a role he took seriously despite being only 2 years older. He brought his guitar every visit and guided her through basic chords with patience that would have surprised his own teachers, who dealt with his restless energy during regular school hours. Emma's fingers struggled with the shapes, her small hands not quite ready for the stretches required. But she persisted with the same determination she'd applied to speech, each small victory celebrated as evidence that what had been impossible last week might become routine next month. Dylan showed her a simple 3-chord progression. Okay, so this is C, then G, then D. You'll use these in basically every song ever written. Emma positioned her fingers carefully, pressed down, strummed. The sound emerged muddy and unclear, more noise than music, but she grinned with unguarded joy at having created it herself. Dylan had adjusted her thumb position. Try it again, and don't worry about it being perfect. Music isn't about perfect, it's about feeling. Emma tried again. This time the chord rang clearer, recognizable as intentional sound rather than accident. She looked up at Dylan with eyes that suggested she'd discovered something precious and previously unimaginable. I made music. Dylan grinned. Yeah, you did. And you're going to make a lot more. The Foundation's 6-month review meeting convened with representatives from 12 screening clinics, reporting outcomes that exceeded even Victoria's aggressive projections. 8,000 children evaluated. 63 cases of misdiagnosis identified and corrected. 63 families given back futures they'd been told were impossible. But the numbers that mattered most to Victoria sat in a manila folder marked with Emma's name. Dr. Patterson had requested this meeting specifically to discuss findings that would reshape everything they thought they understood about her daughter's case. The medical conference room felt too small for the implications about to unfold. Victoria sat across from Dr. Patterson and the audiologist who'd been tracking Emma's recovery. Ben attended at Victoria's request, his presence grounding in ways she'd stopped questioning. Dr. Patterson pulled up imaging on the display screen, recent scans compared against the original diagnosis from 8 years prior. I've been reviewing Emma's complete medical history, trying to understand how the initial diagnosis went so wrong. And I found something. He clicked through images, highlighting neural pathways that glowed in false color. These are Emma's auditory nerve response patterns. Current testing compared to neonatal screening. Victoria leaned forward, trying to decipher the technical display. What am I looking at? Completely normal neural development. Dr. Patterson's voice carried professional frustration edged with anger at systemic failure. No damage, no abnormalities, no genetic markers for congenital hearing loss. The original diagnosis was entirely incorrect. Emma never had congenital auditory nerve damage. She had perfect biological hearing capability from birth. The words seemed to echo in the small room, their implications too large for the space. Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest, spreading outward until her hands trembled against the armrests. But the specialists she started, multiple specialists confirmed. They confirmed a misdiagnosis, Dr. Patterson interrupted gently. Probably based on a misread initial screening, then reinforced through confirmation bias. Once Emma was labeled congenitally deaf, every subsequent test got interpreted through that framework. The foreign object caused symptoms that seemed to support the original diagnosis, so no one questioned the foundation. Ben's voice cut through Victoria's spiraling thoughts. Are you saying Emma could have heard perfectly her entire life if someone had just removed that plastic fragment in the NICU? Dr. Patterson met his eyes directly. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Victoria stood abruptly, her body rejecting information too painful to integrate while sitting still. She moved to the window overlooking the parking lot, watching people move through ordinary days while her understanding of her daughter's childhood shattered and reformed into something unbearable. 8 years, her voice emerged barely above whisper. She lost 8 years of actual hearing. Actual normal development. Because of a mistake, Ben crossed to stand beside her, not touching, but present in the way he'd learned she sometimes needed. She didn't lose 8 years. They were taken. There's a difference. The distinction felt academic. Victoria pressed her forehead against the cool glass and tried to imagine telling Emma this truth, explaining that the deafness that had defined her childhood had never been real, had always been preventable, had resulted from human error compounded by institutional arrogance. How do I tell her? Victoria asked the window, the room, the universe that had allowed this to happen. You tell her the truth, Ben replied quietly, and you let her decide how to feel about it. That evening, Victoria sat with Emma on the resort's private beach. The ocean performed its endless percussion, waves that Emma could now hear as more than vibration, transformed into actual sound that carried meaning and nuance. Victoria struggled to find words adequate for the magnitude of what needed saying. Con you, the doctors discovered something else about your hearing. Emma looked up from the sand castle she'd been building, her expression open and curious. Good something or bad something? Victoria's chest tightened. Complicated something. The original doctors who said you were born deaf, they made a mistake. You weren't born deaf at all. Your hearing was always perfect. It was just blocked by that piece of plastic. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to important topics. So I was supposed to hear? The whole time? Yes, Emma returned to her sandcastle, patting walls smooth with methodical care. That means I didn't lose 8 years. I was just late to hearing. The words struck Victoria with unexpected force, her daughter's wisdom cutting through guilt and rage to something approaching acceptance. But Emma, you miss so much. Sounds, conversations, music, everything children should experience. Emma looked up again, her eyes holding steady on her mother's face. But now I get them. And I know they're special because I didn't always have them. Kids who always heard don't know how cool it is. I know. Victoria pulled her daughter close, crying into hair that smelled like salt water and childhood finally allowed to be messy. Emma tolerated the embrace with patient understanding, then offered perspective that suggested she'd been thinking about this longer than the 5 minutes since revelation. Also, if the doctors didn't make the mistake, Ben wouldn't have found me, and Dylan wouldn't be my friend, and you wouldn't have started the foundation helping all those other kids. So maybe the mistake was supposed to happen so good things could come after. Victoria held tighter, marveling at her daughter's capacity to find meaning in suffering, to extract purpose from pain. It was the kind of wisdom that should have taken decades to develop, not 8 years of childhood stolen by institutional failure. The medical conference in Boston wanted Emma to speak, to tell her story to physicians whose careers depended on not making the same mistakes. Victoria initially hesitated, protective of her daughter's privacy, but Emma insisted with the same determination that had carried her through speech therapy and school integration. I need to tell them. So they listened to other kids the way Ben listened to me. The conference hall held 500 medical professionals, their credentials and expertise creating an atmosphere of intellectual authority that might have intimidated most 9-year-olds. Emma walked to the podium wearing her school uniform and visible hearing aid, carrying herself with composure beyond her years. My name is Emma Hartwell. I was told I was born deaf for 8 years, but I was just born unlucky. The room went still, medical professionals recognizing a case study they'd read about taking human form. Emma continued, her speech clear enough that only someone listening for hesitation would notice the careful way she formed certain sounds. I tried to tell people my ear hurt. I drew pictures. I signed. I did everything I knew how to say pain. But everyone looked at me and saw deaf. They didn't see hurting. They didn't listen. She paused, making eye contact with audience members in the way her speech therapist had taught her. One person listened, not a doctor, not someone with letters after his name, just someone who paid attention. Ben saw pain when everyone else saw disability. Ben sat in the back row, uncomfortable with attention, but present because Emma had asked. Victoria beside him, Dylan on her other side, the three of them forming her family in configuration that still surprised them with its rightness. Emma's voice strengthened. The foundation. My mom found 63 kids like me in 6 months. 63 kids who were called deaf but were really just hurting. How many more are out there? How many kids are drawing pictures nobody looks at? She let the question hang, challenging authority that had failed her and countless others. Then she delivered the lines she'd been practicing, words that would be quoted in medical journals and teaching hospitals. Listening and hearing are different things. One is what your ears do, one is what your heart does. My mom had ears for 8 years. Ben had a heart from day one. That's why he found me. The applause started scattered and built to sustained recognition. Medical professionals acknowledging truth delivered by someone whose expertise came from lived experience rather than academic study. Emma stepped back from the podium and found Victoria's eyes across the crowded room, seeking approval she'd already earned 1,000 times over. Later, medical students surrounded her with questions. How did it feel when you first heard sound? What helped most with speech development? What can we do better for future patients? Emma answered each with patience and honesty, becoming educator to people who would someday hold other children's futures in their diagnostic assessments. The custody review hearing happened in early August, 6 months after the initial ruling that had granted Ben primary placement. The judge wanted confirmation that Dylan's living situation remained stable and appropriate, standard procedure for cases where dramatic changes had occurred. Ben arrived at the courthouse wearing the same suit Victoria had bought him for the original hearing. Dylan beside him looking older than his 10 years in khakis and a button-down shirt. Across the aisle, Dylan's grandmother sat with her lawyer, but her expression had softened from the defensive anger of 6 months prior. The social worker assigned to Dylan's case presented her findings with professional neutrality. Mr. Torres has maintained steady employment with the Hartwell Foundation. The apartment provided through his position meets all safety and space requirements. Dylan's grades have improved, his attendance is perfect, and psychological evaluations indicate he's thriving in his current placement. The judge reviewed the file, then looked at Dylan directly. Son, I want to hear from you. How are things going with your dad? Dylan sat straighter. Really good, Your Honor. Dad makes me breakfast every day. He helps with homework, even when the math is hard for him, too. And he teaches me that showing up matters more than being perfect. The judge's expression softened slightly. What does that mean? Showing up matters more than being perfect. Dylan glanced at Ben before answering. It means he's there. Every day. Even when things are hard. He doesn't run away anymore. And that makes me feel safe. The grandmother's lawyer had no objections to continuing the current arrangement. The judge granted permanent modification of the custody order with satisfaction that suggested he'd seen too many cases go the other way. Outside the courthouse, Dylan's grandmother approached Ben with tentative steps. Can I talk to you for a minute? Ben nodded, gesturing for Dylan to wait with Victoria, who'd attended as character witness. The grandmother's eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice stayed steady. I was wrong. About you. About thinking you couldn't take care of him. She swallowed hard. He's happier with you than I've seen him since Sarah died. And I'm grateful you didn't let my fear keep you from fighting for him. Ben felt something unknot in his chest that had been tight for 8 years. You love him. That's all that mattered. You kept him safe when I couldn't. Can I still see him? Not just the court-ordered weekends, but when he wants to visit. Anytime. You are his grandmother. That doesn't change. They shook hands, tentative peace between people who'd been adversaries but shared love for the same child. Dylan watched from across the parking lot, old enough to understand what reconciliation looked like, even when adults struggled to name it. As September arrived, Victoria began planning an event that would serve multiple purposes. The Foundation's 1-year anniversary, Emma's 9th birthday, a celebration that combined institutional achievement with personal milestone, public acknowledgement with private joy. The resort's ballroom underwent transformation that spoke to careful thought rather than merely expensive decoration. Children's artwork from Foundation screening clinics covered one wall, testimonials from families whose lives had changed because someone finally listened. Tables held centerpieces made by Emma's classmates, their creative interpretations of what hearing meant rendered in construction paper and enthusiasm. Emma helped with planning, her input carrying equal weight to professional event coordinators. She wanted music, specifically Dylan performing, and space for dancing because movement to rhythm still felt like discovered magic. She wanted beach access so guests could experience the ocean the way she'd learned to, through multiple senses working together. The invitation list grew to include medical professionals who'd embraced the Foundation's mission, donors whose money funded screening clinics, and families whose children had been saved from years of misdiagnosis. But Emma insisted on keeping it personal too. Her classmates and teachers invited alongside billionaires and hospital administrators. This is for everyone who helped me here, she explained. Not just doctors and important people, everyone who made the effort. The evening of September 21st arrived with weather that felt personally arranged. Clear skies and gentle breeze that carried ocean scent without the harsh cold that would come in another month. Guests began arriving at 6, the ballroom filling with conversations that ranged from medical protocol discussions to children comparing notes about third-grade teachers. Emma wore a dress she'd chosen herself, deep blue that matched her eyes, her hearing aid decorated with small silver stars Dylan had helped her apply. She moved through the crowd with confidence that would have been impossible a year ago, speaking to adults and children with equal ease, her voice carrying only the slightest trace of the struggle that came with learning speech after 8 years of silence. Victoria watched from near the Foundation display, seeing her daughter transform not just in capability, but in fundamental sense of belonging. Emma no longer stood apart from the world, watching it move without her. She participated fully, created her own noise, demanded space that had been denied too long. Ben found Victoria in her observation, Dylan beside him carrying the guitar case that had become extension of his identity. You ready for this? Victoria smiled. For which part? The Foundation milestone, Emma's birthday, or the speech where I have to talk about the worst mistake of my life in front of 500 people? All of it. Ben's hand found hers briefly, contact that had become natural over months of partnership, evolving into something neither had named but both recognized. You're going to be great, and Emma's going to steal the show anyway. Dylan grinned. She's already got my guitar solo planned out, very specific about which songs I should play. The formal program began at 7. Victoria took the podium with Emma beside her, both of them visible representations of how far they'd traveled in the 12 months. Victoria spoke about the foundation's impact, the 12,000 children screened, the 147 misdiagnoses corrected, the hospital protocols changed across 18 states. But the real story, Victoria continued, isn't institutional reform. It's about believing children when they tell us something's wrong. It's about trusting observation over assumption. It's about understanding that expertise without empathy is just credentials on a wall. She turned to Emma, inviting her daughter to share the microphone. Emma stepped forward with the kind of presence that came from having survived something that should have broken her, but instead had refined her into someone stronger. A year ago, I couldn't hear my own voice. Today, I'm talking to hundreds of people, and every word matters. Her voice carried across the room without amplification, clear and strong. The audience leaned forward, recognizing something authentic in a world drowning in carefully crafted messages. People say I lost 8 years, but I learned something important. She paused, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. You can't lose what was stolen. You can only decide what you do with what's left. Victoria's breath caught, hearing her daughter articulate philosophy that had taken Victoria months to develop through therapy and soul-searching. Emma continued, "The doctors were wrong. My mom was scared. Everyone made mistakes. But one person," she turned to find Ben in the crowd, refused to walk away. "Ben taught me that sometimes the most important thing isn't knowing everything. It's caring enough to look closely." She gestured for Ben to join her on stage. He shook his head, uncomfortable, but Emma's insistence brooked no refusal. Finally, he stood and walked to the podium, feeling 500 pairs of eyes tracking his movement. Emma reached for his hand the way she always did when she needed grounding. "This is the person who saved me. Not because he's smart or important, because he showed up, because he listened, because when it was easier to look away, he looked closer." She turned back to the audience. The foundation helps kids get heard. But it started because one person heard me first. That's what heroes do. They pay attention when everyone else stops caring. The applause built slowly, starting with Emma's classmates and spreading through medical professionals and donors and families whose lives had intersected with this story. Ben stood awkwardly, accepting recognition he'd never sought, while Emma beamed beside him and Victoria fought tears that came from pride rather than guilt for the first time in a year. After the formal speeches, the evening shifted to celebration. Dylan sat up near the windows overlooking the ocean and began playing, his fingers moving through melodies he'd composed specifically for tonight. Emma danced with her classmates, her movements uninhibited in ways that spoke to finally being comfortable in her own experience. Victoria found herself pulled into conversations with donors and medical directors, each interaction reinforcing that the foundation had become something beyond redemption for her personal failures. It was real institutional change, preventing suffering for children she'd never meet, transforming one family's tragedy into protection for thousands. But eventually she extracted herself and found Ben on the terrace where they'd stood so many times before. The ocean maintained its rhythm beneath stars that blazed in unpolluted sky, indifferent to human drama, but constant in ways that felt comforting. "Hell of a year," Ben offered. Victoria laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement rather than bitter irony. "That's an understatement. 12 months ago, I thought I knew everything about my daughter. Turns out I knew nothing that mattered. You knew you loved her. That matters." Victoria turned to face him directly. "What is this? Us, I mean. We've been dancing around it for months. Partnership? Friendship? Something else?" Ben's expression remained thoughtful. "Whatever you're comfortable with. I'm not in any position to make demands. What if I wanted it to be more than partnership?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had fully explored. Ben's hand found hers, tentative contact that suggested possibility without demanding immediate answers. "Then we take it slow, figure it out together. Dylan comes first for me, Emma for you. but maybe there's space for us to build something alongside that, if you want. Victoria squeezed his hand, accepting terms that left room for fear and hope to coexist. I want. I'm just not entirely sure what that looks like yet. Neither am I, Ben admitted. But I've learned that sometimes not knowing is okay if you're with someone who's willing to figure it out together. They stood together, watching moonlight on waves, two people learning to build something new from the wreckage of what they'd lost. Inside, guitar music carried through open windows. Dylan's playing, accompanied by Emma's voice, attempting harmony she'd never have achieved a year ago. Emma appeared in the terrace doorway, her face flushed from dancing and laughter. Mommy, Ben, come dance, please. Victoria hesitated, conscious of the crowd, the cameras that had documented tonight's event. But Emma's hands pulled at both of them with insistence that didn't accept refusal, and somehow that mattered more than maintaining appropriate boundaries. Yu, there are people watching. Important people. Emma's response carried the kind of clarity that came from 8 years of being watched but not seen. So let them watch me being happy. That's what tonight is for. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, the last resistance to fully embracing joy collapsing under her daughter's simple logic. She took Emma's hand and Ben's and let herself be pulled back inside where Dylan had started playing something upbeat that demanded movement. The three of them danced with abandon that would definitely appear in tomorrow's coverage. Billionaire CEO and maintenance director and child who shouldn't have been able to hear the music but was creating her own rhythm anyway. Dylan captured it on his phone between guitar phrases, preserving the moment when formality gave way to genuine celebration. Later, much later, after guests had departed and cleanup crews had restored the ballroom to its default elegance, the four of them sat on the beach in evening clothes inappropriate for sand and salt water. Emma had convinced everyone that birthday cake should be eaten on the beach at midnight because rules about appropriate behavior were less important than creating moments worth remembering. Dylan strummed his guitar softly, playing melodies that mixed with wave sounds into something that felt like soundtrack for their particular kind of found family. Emma leaned against Victoria, her energy finally depleted after hours of being the center of attention. Best birthday ever, she announced to the ocean and the stars and anyone who might be listening. Victoria kissed the top of her daughter's head. I'm glad, Yu. You deserve 1,000 more just like it. Emma was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the kind of profundity that sometimes emerged when children were tired enough to bypass their filters. I'm glad I was late to hearing. If I'd always heard, I wouldn't know how special it is. I wouldn't have met Ben and Dylan. Mom wouldn't have started the foundation. All those other kids wouldn't have been helped. Dylan stopped playing, struck by the observation. So you're saying the bad thing had to happen so the good things could come after? Not had to, Emma corrected. Just did. And we get to choose what we make from it. Ben and Victoria exchanged glances across the children, both recognizing wisdom that had taken them decades to approach and their children had somehow internalized through sheer necessity of survival. The ocean rumbled its endless commentary, waves that Emma could finally hear creating percussion for a life that shouldn't have been possible, according to expert consensus, but existed anyway because one person had trusted observation over authority. Victoria pulled her daughter closer, Ben's arms settling around her shoulders with familiarity that suggested they'd been building toward this configuration for longer than either had consciously acknowledged. Dylan pressed against Ben's other side, his guitar quiet now, all of them watching moonlight dance on water. Emma spoke once more before sleep claimed her, her voice carrying the drowsy certainty of children who'd learned to survive what should have broken them. The best sound isn't music or ocean. It's people you love saying they won't give up on you. That's the sound of hope. Everyone deserves to hear it. The words settled over them like blessing, simple truth that contained everything that mattered. Victoria felt Ben's hand tighten on her shoulder, felt Emma's steady breathing against her chest, heard Dylan's quiet agreement hummed in melody, too soft for words. They sat together a September night deepened toward autumn, four people who'd found each other through crisis and chosen to remain together through healing. Not because blood or obligation demanded it, but because they'd learned that family meant showing up even when it was hard, listening even when silence was easier, believing even when everyone else had stopped looking. The ocean maintained its rhythm, indifferent but constant. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had existed before any of them were born and would continue after they were gone. And in that moment, with guitar and waves and breathing and hope all creating symphony from what had been silence, they understood something fundamental about human resilience. The hardest lessons often taught the most about what could be survived. The stolen years couldn't be recovered, but the years ahead stretched unlimited with possibility. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough to find people who refused to walk away, being late to hearing meant you appreciated every sound like the miracle it actually was. Emma slept peacefully in her mother's arms, her dreams full of music and laughter and voices that belonged to people who'd fought for her right to hear them. Victoria held her daughter and let herself imagine futures that extended beyond guilt and fear into something that might eventually resemble peace. Ben sat with his son close and his heart full of gratitude for second chances he'd thought were gone forever. Dylan played quiet melodies for an audience of stars and family, his music speaking what words couldn't quite capture about belonging and home, and the particular kind of love that chose you rather than being assigned by biology. And the ocean, ancient and impartial, bore witness to their small triumph over institutional failure and human error, its waves applauding in the only language that transcended all others, the sound of life continuing despite everything that tried to silence it.